Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first national teach-in for the Teach-In Network. My name is Ryan Black. I am an organizer at rootsaction.org, and through that, the Teach-In Network. Thank you all so much for being here. We have a great group of speakers we will be getting to here shortly. But first, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the Teach-In Network and what we're doing here. Um, Knowledge is power, and our grassroots movement needs both. That's why we started the Teach-In Network, to bring people together, to share knowledge, and to build power by organizing in the face of increasing opposition to organizing. So what is the Teach-In Network? The Teach-In Network is a network of organizers from rootsaction.org and expert speakers, many of them professors from across the country, coming together to provide teach-in resources to groups on and off campus to empower them to challenge militarism and the political establishment. The network is comprised of toolboxes for different categories, different subjects. For instance, tonight we're talking about Gaza, Israel, and the Middle East. And within those toolboxes, we have primers, presentations, videos, video series, visual resources, suggested social media accounts to follow, important articles that you can center conversations around, and of course, the most important thing is access to our expert speakers, some of whom you're going to meet tonight. Of course, everything the Teach-In Network offers is totally free, including this teach-in, and we also have two more teach-ins scheduled for January 9th and January 29th. So if you go to the same link you used to register for this event, you will find two more events that you can register for how to protest and foreign policy. Well, of course, offering this for free doesn't mean that building websites and paying our staff is free. So if you can, we strongly encourage you to donate or to share the network with your friends and colleagues who may be able to donate so we can continue building this network. We can continue having events like these, and we can help campuses and organizers all across the country continue to organize against the genocide in Gaza, against war generally, against militarism, and for people in peace. So with that, um, as we go, I will be showing you the Teach-In Network a little bit more. But right now, we are going to get started with our first speaker. Assal Rad will be speaking about the media landscape, the Biden administration's mishandling of the region, and anything else that she wants to talk about today. Assal is a historian of modern Middle East. She has a PhD from the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Assal Rad, please take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for the introduction and for everyone who's joining us today. And of course, I'm happy to be here with my fellow panelists to have this discussion. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible. I always say that and then run on, but I'll try to be brief so we have more time for questions and discussion. So if you're looking at how the Biden administration has handled the region, especially since the attacks of Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7th and after that, right? Because you can look at the administration as a whole for 4 years and they've handled it terribly the entire time. But what we have seen in the last 14 months or so could be best sort of summed up as allowing Israel to act with total impunity, with zero consequences, and shattering anything that even pretended to be international law prior to these events. That's the best way of summing it up. So what does that exactly mean? Obviously, the most pressing, important, significant matter is the fact that there is an continuing genocide in Gaza. Nothing is more significant than that fact, and the fact that we, the United States, our role goes beyond complicity. We are actively participating in a genocide knowingly, right? Every significant international institution, human rights organization, has now come out and called it exactly what it is, a genocide. And yet, not only is the US engaging in genocide denial, it's actually aiding and arming that genocide. Now, what else is happening in the region in terms of how the Biden administration has handled things? Well, if you're looking at just the Palestinian territories and and Palestinian statehood, you have pogroms that are being carried out in the West Bank. They are not The Biden admin takes the stance of basically every previous U.S. administration, except for with the exception of the Trump administration, that the West Bank the settlements are illegal. The settlements in the West Bank are illegal, and yet they take no action to actually to address the fact that the military that we are funding and arming is what is instilling and maintaining that occupation in those settlements. You've seen settler violence, extremism increase, and I use the word extremism, but I think when I use extremism, I'm talking about the ideological outlook that someone might have. But in terms of a fringe opinion within Israeli society, that's just not the case anymore, right? You have a far-right government that leads Israel and a society that in many ways is supporting everything that's going on. And it's in part because of that impunity, right? When there's no checks and balances on anything, when you're allowed to use genocidal language, incite genocidal language, and actually carry out those actions, then there's no limitations to what can be done. And so we're seeing how that's playing out in the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. So those are Palestinian territories. We saw Israel invade Lebanon, devastate so much of the country, displace 25% of the population, kill, I think the death toll is over 4,000 in Lebanon. We've seen now Israel immediately exploit the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and invade Syria, which it already occupies illegally, the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria, but it's crossed those borders and gone into further Syrian territory. So what you see is an ethno-nationalist state with absolutely no limitations that is carrying out a genocide in Gaza, that is expanding settlements and ethnically cleansing parts of the West Bank, that is besieging the north of Gaza, that's starving people. All of this is being done out in the open, to the point where Israeli soldiers actually share posts on social media. They videotape their war crimes and show them, because that is the level of impunity with which they have been operating. And all of this has not happened despite the Biden administration's attempt to stop it. It's happened because the Biden administration has 100% fully backed every part of it from beginning to end. You can just look at one example of that. The fact that Secretary of State Blinken was told by US agencies, right, his agencies within his own department, that Israel was deliberately blocking aid and causing famine and starvation in Gaza. Secretary of State Blinken ignored those reports. In early May, he testified, he lied to Congress, essentially, and he testified that Israel is not deliberately doing so. We saw aid decline throughout the summer months, and October was the worst month thus far in terms of trucks getting into Gaza. And despite all of that, and a sort of 30-day letter that the 30-day deadline that the Biden admin gave to Israel to address that issue, none of it was addressed. The famine conditions continue, and the administration has taken no action against it. So that's where we see a very general landscape of what's going on and how the Biden admin has handled it. They've handled it by letting them do whatever they want. And a lot of times it's presented as though, it's presented in the media, because I want to get to the media part of this, it's presented as though the Biden admin and President Biden are really trying to change they're really working on a ceasefire. They're really working to get aid into Gaza. And the reality of that is all of this has been in control of this administration. The sort of anecdote that's been used repeatedly is Ronald Reagan, President Reagan at the time, in 1981, picking up the phone and telling an Israeli official, or his Israeli counterpart, the bombing has to stop now in Lebanon. And within 30 minutes of that conversation, or 20 minutes of that conversation, the bombing stopped. That is the power that the United States has. You have Israeli officials saying that the only reason Israel can carry out, its military can carry out these operations, is because of direct US support, US weapons, US funding. And so it's not that the Biden admin's hands are tied and there was nothing they could do. They never attempted to use the leverage because they greenlit everything that has come to pass. What the media has done is very similar to what we saw the media do in the lead up to the Iraq invasion of 2003, right? They're just parroting They're basically acting as stenographers for not only the US government, but also in many ways the Israeli government. There is greater criticism of Israeli officials and the Israeli government's actions in Israeli media than there is in Western media. If you look at the Western media landscape, for instance, in the way that the ceasefire talks, which have now been going on for however many months, beginning in May, have been going on, you get the impression, based on what based on what U.S. officials are saying, that the impediment to a ceasefire is Hamas. When you look at Israeli media, it's the exact opposite of that. The impediment to a ceasefire is Netanyahu. He's been sabotaging it from day one. He never actually wanted. He never actually cared about getting the hostages out. This is the narrative within Israeli media, whereas in U.S. media, their narrative is that Hamas is the obstacle, and the Biden admin is working to get a deal. Essentially, Western media has whitewashed Israel's crimes, starting with the fact that they, in many ways, refuse to address the idea of genocide. You had a UN Commission report in mid-November, United Nations Commission report, that said Israel's actions in Gaza are consistent with genocide. And there was basically a media blackout on that report. There was almost no coverage of a UN report calling Israel's actions genocide. That's an incredible omission of vital information about what is going on. And that has been the case overall about how the media has handled things. You see headlines all the time where the media does not attribute airstrikes or bombings where people are killed in Gaza. They don't attribute it to Israel. Or when Israel is mentioned in the headline, it's done so in passive voice. And even when it's done in passive voice, there's the addition of, a clause that casts doubt on whether or not this actually happened, because it's witnesses say, doctors say, Gaza Health Ministry says, rather than just stating facts as facts. Whenever a international institution comes out and says Israel's actions constitute genocide, for instance, Amnesty International, which recently had released a report saying exactly that this is genocide, that is not how the media treats it. These are all accusations. Accusations of war crimes when there are ICC warrants issued for Israeli officials. So that is the very sort of brief way of summarizing what we have done, how this administration has handled things, the extent to which Israel has been allowed to act with total impunity, the destruction of international law, as well as Gaza itself, and the fact that the media has acted basically as propagandists, allowing this to happen without question, without questioning those sources that are carrying these atrocities out.
Thank you so much, Assal. First question, we'll get right into the questions. To you, what do you think is the underlying reason for the US's blind complicity? And that question is from Judy in the chat.
I think there's different motivating factors, right? When you're talking about any government or any group of people, we can never paint them with one brush because they're not a monolith. So even when we're talking about the US government, individual actors will have different motivations for why this sort of, I mean, we avoid using certain words, right? Extremism is reserved for Muslims, basically. Like, those are the only religious extremists. We don't call Christian religious extremists or Jewish religious extremists we don't talk about them in the same way. And I think part one motivation is ideological, right? There is one strand of thought within sort of evangelical Zionism that very much believes in a certain interpretation of religious doctrine, and that is a driving motivation. There is political motivations from lobbying groups like AIPAC, which boasts publicly about how much money they pour into elections and how their candidates get elected. So you better be, you better align with AIPAC on Israel, or they're going to make sure that your opponent gets millions and millions of dollars to defeat you. There is, larger motivations within the US sort of war machine in general, right? Why we are trapped in an endless war, because it feeds certain industries. And so there are motivations behind that. And I think there's there's another underlying factor is that we're just sort of used to it. This has become so normalized, right? This kind of thinking has become so normalized that the logic of it, the rationality of it is never even questioned. Certain turns of phrase have been used so repeatedly that we just assume this is truth and we never question. And I'll give you an example. Israel has the right to defend itself. How many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard that sentence? Have you ever heard Syria has the right to defend itself? Lebanon has the right to defend itself. Iran has the right to defend itself. Iraq has the right to defend itself. I've never heard a US official say that, say any of those things. So these things get repeated over and over again, and they sort of become ingrained in the way that we think. So I think the first step is in asking these questions. But there's definitely varying motivations as to why we see this level of really fanaticism when it comes to US policy on Israel.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Two more questions. I'd say quick questions, but
I'll try.
nothing is a quick question really with this, with the genocide. This is a really important one. I'm not sure who wrote this. JS. With the failure of international law to prevent a genocide, how likely is there a chance that maybe eventually a new system could be put into place to combat this? Like how the United Nations replaced the League of Nations, but it's failed in this situation. Is there something else that we could be striving towards that could work?
So the UN, the United Nations, is a gigantic organization that carries out many functions, right? For instance, UNICEF is a UN is part of the UN, is a UN body, and it does vital work on the ground. UNRWA is a UN organization doing vital work on the ground in Gaza, making sure that people are getting aid, things like that. So when we talk about the UN's failure to do certain things, we're talking about the sort of security aspect of the United Nations. And clearly, the time has come to replace that system. Now, the reason I said the other things that the UN does is because is it a question of do you replace the United Nations with something entirely new, or do you reform it fundamentally? For instance, by changing the idea of 5 permanent members with veto power, right? A very basic thing that could be reformed that would change the nature of the Security Council. Um, I think what we're dealing with obviously is a system that has always, I mean, it's not, did it hold the United States accountable when it illegally invaded Iraq or the many times in which we just bomb countries at will? No. So it's not that the international system has been really great up until now. It's just that what has happened in Gaza is so egregious that it's such a mask off moment that everyone can see it now. Whereas there was a rhetoric behind this notion of a rules-based order in international law that has been completely shattered. And so I think that there's definitely, we're at an inflection point where it requires, if not an entirely new body, an entirely new institution, fundamental reform within that institution.
Right. And I guess last question, really quickly, are we justified in thinking things are going to get a lot worse under Trump? And what does worse look like?
That is a hard question because it requires some level of prediction, and I tend to avoid any kind of prediction because they're not, we're not, these situations and events are not predictable by their nature. But on top of that, Donald Trump is not predictable. Like if, you know, I mean, I would not have predicted that Joe Biden would help commit a genocide. That definitely wouldn't have been my guess. But his politics, right? But I would have known that he's an extreme Zionist and would just support anything that Israel does. We just didn't think that it would go this far, right? So there's a very clear political ideology that informs most of the people that we've seen as presidents. Donald Trump is not that. He doesn't have a political ideology necessarily, right? It's not shaped in the same way because he's not really a politician. And so, can it get worse? Of course, it can get worse because he can basically, where at least the Biden admin uses the language of some limitations, right? They recognize, for instance, that the West Bank is called the West Bank and that settlements are illegal. They recognize that the UN bordering lines of Lebanon and Syria, even though they maintained the Trump administration's view of the Golan Heights, they still have some concept of there are borders. I don't know that Donald Trump would necessarily have that. Would he, when the administration recognized the Golan Heights, would they now recognize more territory that Israel is trying to seize in and occupy in Syria? How would a Trump administration treat, southern Lebanon, the West Bank? All of these things are very important. At the same time, he has talked about ending the wars, and I think there, if he stays by his own words, right? Like he's has this notion of being an anti-war president, having never started a new war. If he actually tries to maintain that, because he cares more about what people think, right? He cares more about his persona than policies. Then maybe we can actually see the wars that are happening end. But I will say the cabinet, the people that he has selected as advisors and his close circle, do not paint a very optimistic picture of what a Trump administration will bring.
Thank you so much, Assal Rad. Really appreciate your time. We do have a couple more questions. We're going to hold those for the end and move on. Barbara, I see your question's very good about profiting from this and the certain weapons manufacturers. We will get to that at the end. But now we are going to move on to our second speaker, Huwaida Arraf, who's going to be speaking about the legal landscape, situation in the West Bank, ISM, and the Freedom Flotilla. Huwaida is a human and civil rights attorney and is the co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement and an organizer with the Freedom Flotilla. Huwaida, take the floor.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to everyone for being here. I also am deeply honored to be part of this network and be on a panel with people I so admire. That's a lot I was asked to cover in a very short period of time. I don't know if I'm going to get to all of it, but I will really try. So today is the 76th anniversary of the adoption of the Genocide Convention, and tomorrow marks International Human Rights Day. International Human Rights Day marks the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and that enshrines the inalienable rights that every person is entitled to as a human being, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, or any other status. Article 1 of the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is one sentence. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's it. And yet here we are, 76 years after the adoption of these landmark conventions, the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we are 14 months into a live stream genocide that we have not been able to stop. And we have not been able to achieve the simple principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. In fact, the Amnesty International report that Assal alluded to or mentioned, that the title of it is "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman." And that's what Palestinians have been feeling like. And not only Palestinians, right? It's the majority of the global South, that they are not equal, or their lives are not valued as much as Western European American lives. And certainly they have a good reason to think that. But where are we going? We should be working towards a world where everybody is valued as being equal. Looking at the legal landscape over this past year, we have seen a lot of movement on the legal level. And I'll briefly go over those. So it's not for lack of legal action that we have not been able to stop this genocide. It's the problem is the failure of the international community of states to comply with the rulings and to live up to their legal obligations under international law. And that was also alluded to in the questions in terms of, the UN system and where we are with that. But that is one of the main problems of international law. And that question has been asked a lot over the last year specifically, but even way back when I was teaching law in Jerusalem to Palestinian students who would look at me and say, this looks good, but it doesn't apply to us, because going back to whose lives are valued and whose lives are not, and how does the law apply and to who. So there is no enforcement mechanism in international law. That comes back to states and state politics. And so we live in a world where there actually is what the United States refers to a lot as the rules-based order. And a rules-based order is not what we should be striving for, because a rules-based order is an order where the powerful make the rules. It is defined by what the United States and its Western allies consider to be the rules. And of course, they bend it to serve their interest. What we want is the application of international law. So we want an international legal order, a law-based order where the law applies equally to everyone. But to go back, so there have been a lot of movement on the legal level. And to cover those briefly, we had recently, just a couple of months ago, an International Court of Justice advisory opinion that came out in July of this year. And just to make clear, when we say that it's an advisory opinion, it is not that it is any less meaningful in terms of the applicability of the law. People say, oh, it's advisory, it's not binding. All that is meant by it's an advisory opinion is it didn't come as a result of a contention between two states, because the International Court of Justice hears disputes between states and then it renders a decision. In this case, it's not a dispute between states. The UN General Assembly posed some questions to the International Court of Justice, and they studied them and issued an opinion that lays out what the law says. So this is the state of the law. And what this opinion made clear is that Israel is not only occupying Palestinian territory, because it is long disputed that this territory is occupied, but also that this occupation is illegal. Because under international law, occupation is actually not illegal. But because of what Israel has been doing over the last 56 years to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, the occupation has become illegal. They didn't use the word colonizing, but in fact, that's what they have said in terms of establishing settlements and stealing resources. And what it also said is that Israel's actions violate Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Segregation, which is apartheid. So we have a decision by the World Court that Israel is instituting a system of racial segregation and apartheid. It is illegally occupying Palestinian territory. It must dismantle its occupation, all settlements without exception, as quickly as possible. It must pay reparations also, and establish a system by which Palestinians are given reparations. And one of the most important things that should be self-evident, but it made clear, is that Israel is violating the Palestinian right to self-determination. And the Palestinian right to self-determination is a right that's not contingent upon a peace process. It is not subject to any conditions that the occupiers put on it. Palestinians have been due their self-determination, and Israel is currently preventing it, and they are entitled to receive it immediately. And therefore, they put to bed this notion that Palestinians have to negotiate for their basic rights, which is what we always hear by Western countries and from the United States specifically, is that Palestinian freedom is contingent upon a peace process. And we have been beholden to this peace process for decades that has only allowed Israel to entrench its occupation. That, one last thing about that opinion, which is really important, is that it went back and put an obligation on all states and the United Nations and international institutions that they have an obligation to do everything in their power to bring about the end to this illegal occupation as soon as possible. And that includes an obligation not to recognize the illegal situation that Israel has created, not to recognize any settlements, not to do business with settlements, and also to use other mechanisms at its disposal to pressure Israel to end its illegal occupation. So that comes back to, as activists, as people who are working, like, how can we use that to pressure our institutions, our states, our even local bodies to institute boycott, divestment, sanctions, etc., to help pressure Israel to bring its occupation to an end. Then we all, I think, know about South Africa versus Israel, and that is a contentious case before the International Court of Justice. This is South Africa that brought Israel before the International Court of Justice to say Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. And that court found, of course, we won't have a decision for a while because these things unfortunately take a while. So we don't have a pronouncement from the court as to whether Israel's guilty of violating the Genocide Convention. But the court did issue preliminary measures. And that came as a result of a finding that there was a real and imminent risk of prejudice to the rights of the Palestinians not to be subject to acts of genocide. So it found, because the case is going forward, it found that it is plausible that Israel is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. So it's plausible that Israel is committing a genocide, and there's a real and imminent risk of prejudice to the rights of the Palestinian people not to be subject to a genocide. And therefore, it issued these preliminary measures, actually 3 sets of preliminary measures that provided that humanitarian aid needs to get into Gaza ASAP, unrestricted, that fact-finding missions should be allowed in, and Israel must not do anything to hinder the documentation of what is actually happening in Gaza. And Israel also has an obligation to ensure that Palestinians are not subject to acts of genocide, which really would mean Israel needs to stop attacking Gaza, because it has created a situation where it is nearly impossible to live. Of course, it committed all kinds of harms, killing, mental harm, etc. So that's the South Africa v. Israel. That is ongoing. We have a case that's not looked at as much, but Nicaragua brought Germany also before the International Court of Justice to say that Germany is violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention by continuing to supply Israel with weapons by which to commit a genocide. And that case is proceeding, it's going forward, but in that case, Nicaragua also asked for preliminary measures, which the court did not grant. The court didn't grant preliminary measures, not because it found that there isn't a violation here, but Germany argued that they have drastically reduced their weapons sales to Israel, and what contracts they have left, like the little that they have left, is not actually being used to commit the genocide. So that was Germany's argument, and the court tended to agree with that. So while they didn't issue these preliminary measures, they did make some clear pronouncements that are really important, and I just want to mention them briefly. They reiterated that third states have an obligation to ensure that the Genocide Convention and or that states aren't committing genocide, and they have a obligation to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are upheld. So even if these states are not part of a conflict, they still, as third states, have obligations to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are upheld and that the Genocide Convention is not being violated. So that means that they have an obligation to not aid the perpetrator in committing these violations and these acts, which obviously means don't supply them with weapons or any other kind of aid that could help them in violating these conventions. And lastly, we have, as I think everyone knows, the ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. We'll see what is to come of those. Of course, there are 124 states that are part of the International Criminal Court and that are actually under obligation to turn over these two if they come within their jurisdiction. A number of European states have already said that they will uphold their obligations as members of as signatories to the Rome Statute. We've had some countries shamefully wavering, but they are under this obligation, and certainly this will be a test of what is the future of the International Criminal Court? What is the future in terms of all of these cases? What is the future of the international legal order? Because we see the United States being the biggest perpetrators of trying to undermine all of these. The ICC, we might see the Trump administration certainly sanction the ICC, and the United States also trying to undermine the decisions of the International Court of Justice. We have, but I won't get into them, also litigation that can take place.
We're running a little over, Huwaida, so could we wrap up and go to some questions?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, I'll stop there. But just to say that is litigation in domestic courts. There was in the United States and in other courts that can also attempt to hold these perpetrators accountable. And I expect to see more on that front. And we've already had the Netherlands, for example, found that the Netherlands must stop weapons transfers to Israel. There's a case in the UK also on the same basis. But let me stop there.
Sorry, I was muted. Just a couple really quick questions. Thank you so much for that, Huwaida. Have any charges come to the U.S. yet, like they did for Germany for supplying the weapons, or nothing has been brought to the U.S. yet, right?
No, there was a case in the US, actually. It was Defense for Children International versus Biden. It was a lawsuit by a number of Palestinian organizations and individuals against Biden, Blinken, and Austin. Unfortunately, well, that was a landmark case in a number of different ways, including that there were 7 hours of testimony where Palestinians got to testify in terms of what Israel's actions over decades has been doing to their lives. And a, a district court judge in that case um, it really found that this was the most difficult case that he has seen or heard in over 20 years of being on the bench, and that he agreed that it looks like that genocide is being committed, and he urged the United States to reconsider its policy. But he ultimately found that he doesn't have jurisdiction to hear this case because of something called the political question doctrine, which prevents courts from hearing things that might interfere with the prerogative of the executive in making foreign policy. That case was appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit unfortunately upheld that decision, that the courts can't sit in judgment because they would be making a decision on foreign policy, and that is up to the executive. I think it's wrong in many ways, of course, but I don't think we have time to get into that.
Sure.
And unfortunately, over the past 2 decades, there have been a lot of attempts to litigate various company and official support for Israel's illegal conduct, illegal actions, and violations of human rights. And we have bad precedents in the United States, but that doesn't mean we're giving up. I'm currently also looking into some cases, potential cases myself. So we keep going.
All right, thank you. And last, very quick answer. Several more questions we'll try to get to at the end. If you had to give a chance that Netanyahu is ever tried as a war criminal, I think Gallant's coming to the U.S. here soon. He's not going to get arrested here. What do you think the chances are that he ever actually faces responsibility for this?
I also don't like really making predictions. We don't know. We can only hope and work towards that. We do as I hope we've all seen over the past year at least, there has been an awakening in terms of what Israel has been doing, a shattering of this myth that Israel is, a democracy that is the underdog and just kind of um, fighting to protect itself. We have been, and actually an important point I really want to leave everyone with, as we are advocating of and trying to push our institutions and educating people around us in terms of what's happening in an effort to bring it to an end. I would urge people to, as much as possible, focus on the root causes, not just, we all know it's not just October 7th, it's not just an occupation, it is the nature of Israel as a settler colonial project that was established, perpetrated, continues to flourish as part of an ideology, a Zionist ideology, which is a racist supremacist ideology. And so if we're ever going to have peace and security for everybody, irrespective of race, religion, any characteristic at all, we have to dismantle this ideology, and we have to dismantle this system. And so not to get caught up in two states as if there is just a territorial dispute. It is essentially a settler colonial project that is illegitimate. And that's what people need to understand in order to have the correct perspective in terms of what's happening. And so I think the more we do that and people more and more recognize what's happening, we won't be able to keep, the United States won't be able to keep up this farce. And hopefully, it will lead to a day where Netanyahu certainly is prosecuted. But
right. Well,
I don't know.
we can hope for that. Thank you very much, Huwaida. Lots more questions that we can't get to yet, but hopefully at the end we will get to them. I want to quickly say, look in the chat. I've just posted a link there to the Teach-In Network. Donations are so critical to us. I know in politics and activism, we get 100 emails a day begging for donations. This is what we do with the money. We organize, we bring people together, we create networks, we create resources for people. Any amount of money you can give, just sharing our website on your social media networks, with your colleagues, with your friends, anything helps. So I urge you, please donate to the Teach-In Network if you can. And we're just going to continue to host events like these to educate and empower people across the country so we can fight back against this genocide and against militarism generally. Our next speaker, Josh Ruebner, who's going to be speaking about his dissertation research, which I believe we were before the phone call. Yeah, I don't want to say, but sounds like you will be Dr. Ruebner here very soon. So congratulations. He'll be talking about his dissertation and U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel. Josh Ruebner is currently the policy director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project and is the author of Israel, Democracy, or Apartheid State. Dr. Ruebner, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much for inviting me and for all of you being here. I think it's especially appropriate, as Huwaida mentioned, that we're having this conversation on the 76th anniversary of the signing of the Genocide Convention. And also, as Huwaida mentioned, tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. One of the things I learned through the research that I conducted was that Article 13.2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says everyone has the right to leave their country and to return to their country. And the reason why this article was put into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is because when it was being written and adopted in December of 1948, that was being done against the backdrop of Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people from their land, what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba in Arabic, or catastrophe. And in this process, Israel drove from their homes a vast, vast majority of the indigenous Palestinian population, which lived in Palestine at the time and that became Israel. So Israel pushed out of their homes about 80% of the indigenous population that lived there before Israel was established in 1948. Israel destroyed hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns and cities, razing them to the ground, sometimes repopulating them with Israeli Jews. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all of the liberal human rights-based infrastructure of the post-World War II international order was taking place against the backdrop of Israel's settler colonial dispossession of the indigenous Palestinian people. In addition to these two commemorations that Huwaida mentioned, also a few days ago on November 29th, we also marked the 77th commemoration of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. And that Day of Solidarity refers back to the 1947 recommendation by the United Nations General Assembly to partition Palestine against the wishes of its majority indigenous Palestinian inhabitants for the benefit of a minority settler colonial regime. And one thing that I learned through the research that I conducted in the archives was that Palestinians repeatedly, cogently, very forcefully and articulately stated their claim to self-determination at the United Nations when these debates were happening about the future of Palestine in 1947. I want to share with you a remark by Jamal al-Husseini, who was the vice chair of what was called the Arab Higher Committee. This was the representative body of Palestinian Arabs who made the case for Palestinian self-determination at the United Nations more than 3/4 of a century ago. Here's what he said in September of 1947, quote, "The Palestine Arab case is simple and self-evident. Indeed, it hardly needs elaboration. It's based on the high principles of international justice, which are upheld by the civilized world. It is that of a people who desire to live in undisturbed possession of their country, in which they have continually existed, and with which they have become inextricably interwoven. So as Palestinians made this case for their self-determination to be respected and for their country not to be partitioned against their will for the benefit of a foreign minority settler colonial movements, the US had no answer to that. The United States could not articulate a principled reason why Palestine should be partitioned against the wishes of the majority of the indigenous population who live there. And in fact, the State Department described it as a policy based on, quote, expediency to support the partition of Palestine. But one thing that the United States noted was that this was only a recommendation coming from the United Nations. It didn't have the force of law. So the United States actually recognized that Palestine could only be partitioned if it was done peacefully and if it was done consensually, meaning that Palestinians had to agree to it. So when it became clear that Palestinians would not accept the partitioning of their country in 1947, this is very important. The United States actually backed off the idea of partitioning Palestine. And they said because this violates Palestinian self-determination, that the Palestinian people don't agree to the partitioning of their country, we can't enforce this. So instead, in March of 1948, the Truman administration actually tried to turn the matter back over to the UN and hold Palestine as a trusteeship until a fair and a just resolution could be worked out between the indigenous majority Palestinian people and the Zionist settler colonial movement. And this was the policy that the Truman administration actually pursued all the way up until the end of the British rule over Palestine in May of 1948. Now, I'm not trying to whitewash the positions of the United States. In fact, they come in for quite a lot of condemnation for immediately recognizing the state of Israel, despite the fact that the United States recognized that declaring statehood was not the best outcome. They also but they also deserve a lot of condemnation for refusing to sanction Israel at the United Nations in 1948 as Israel continued to drive out the Palestinian people from their homes in violation of repeated Security Council resolutions and calls for ceasefire. And also the United States deserves condemnation for not compelling Israel to take back Palestinian refugees who were exiled from their homes by Israel, despite the fact that you had this written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But why is this history important? Because we have to ask ourselves a question: was the United States in 1947 and in 1948 as complicit in Israel's attempt to erase the presence of the Palestinian people as the United States is today? And I would say unequivocally, the answer is no. Today, the United States is much, much more deeply complicit, and you can make the argument the United States is actually a partner in crime to Israel's genocide that's taking place in Gaza right now. If you look back at history, in 1948, the United States did not send one single bullet to Israel to inflict the Nakba on the Palestinian people. In fact, the reverse is true. The United States imposed an arms embargo on Palestine in 1947 and prevented anyone from receiving weapons. And this was held as a firm policy against the insistence of the Zionist movement. Not one bullet was sent to Israel during the Nakba. We've seen the Biden administration shamefully use its veto power in the Security Council resolutions, in the Security Council, excuse me, on four separate occasions to veto ceasefire resolutions. 1 second, excuse me. My apologies, I'm dealing with a little cold. The Biden administration has vetoed Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire on 4 different occasions since October 2023. On the other hand, if we look at US policy in 1948, the Truman administration actually wrote, drafted, supported 11 different Security Council attempts to get Israel to stop fighting and stop driving Palestinians from their homes. And the Truman administration never ever supported what Israel did in terms of driving Palestinians from their homes and exiling them. But we've seen repeatedly how the Biden administration has provided Israel not only with the diplomatic means, but with the actual weapons to drive over 90% of Palestinians from their homes in the Gaza Strip, repeatedly forcing them to flee into safe zones that have not been safe at all and have been subject to Israeli attacks. The United States was deeply, deeply concerned by what Israel did to the Palestinian people in 1948. I want to leave you with a quote from a person by the name of Mark Etheridge. He was the U.S. representative to a body that was established by the United Nations at the tail end of 1948, called the Palestine Conciliation Commission. The Palestine Conciliation Commission was supposed to, among other tasks, allow Palestinian refugees who had been forced from their homes in what became Israel to return to those homes in conjunction with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here's what Mark Etheridge, the US representative on that body, said in February of 1949. He said, quote, "I'm afraid that the Jews have learned too much in terrorism from the masters who taught it to them, Germany, Poland, and Russia." And hearing some of the reports that Mark Etheridge sent back to President Truman about the dire status of Palestinian refugees, whose status in 1948 was incredibly similar to the horrific conditions that Palestinians are facing in the Gaza Strip today, Truman himself pronounced himself, quote, "disgusted with Israel's treatment of Palestinians being driven from their homes." So we have a second Trump administration coming in right now, and we've seen how extremist Israeli government ministers have been hatching plans to recolonize Gaza and also to formally annex the West Bank. This should drop any pretensions of any Israeli desire for there to be any form of any type of Palestinian state in any small portion of historic Palestine. Clearly, Israel has taken the steps to make a two-state resolution, if it were ever just at all, and we can have a conversation about that, impossible and not feasible. So we're at an inflection point in history where not only do we have to end the genocide that's taking place, but we have to reconceptualize what it means for there to be a just and lasting resolution, which is centered on the right of the Palestinian people and the refugees to return to their homes, and for the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination.
Thank you so much, Josh. Appreciate that. We do have several questions in, and thank you for all the attendings for engaging so much with this. We have too many questions, which is a good problem to have. Carol asked, didn't the Obama administration sign like a 10-year agreement for armed support for Israel? And is that shouldn't that be coming to an end, or was that extended? What's going on there?
Yeah, the Obama administration set a record-breaking deal for weapons to Israel for $30 billion over the course of 10 years. That agreement does expire in 2028. It's believed that the incoming Trump administration will start the negotiating process with Israel for a new memorandum of understanding, which will probably boost the levels of U.S. weaponry being flooded to Israel. But it's also important to note that over the course of the past 14 months, Congress has passed an additional $14 billion in weapons to Israel on top of the almost $4 billion that Israel gets in a normal annual appropriation. So the United States has, almost more than quadrupled, I'm not so good at math, more than quadrupled the normal amount of funds that it gives in weapons to Israel, making the U.S. complicit in this genocide, as was discussed by other panelists as well.
Great, thank you. Kind of a two-part question here, because it's a question from a couple different places. I'm going to try to combine. Is it true that Truman recognized Israel right away after following the declaration? And then part two of that is, you talked about Truman tried to get Israel to stop driving Palestinians from their land. So I guess that's an interesting dynamic with Truman then. And then I guess the second part of that is, When did that, if it's true that Truman was trying to stop Israel from driving Palestinians away, when did that become an unpopular opinion for a president to have?
Yeah, it's true that Truman did recognize Israel right away, but he never supported the notion of Israel expanding beyond the boundaries recommended to it by the UN in its partition recommendation of 1947. And it's an often forgotten piece of history that the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which establishes the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and their properties and be compensated for any losses, that was a resolution that was actually supported by the United States. The United States voted for it. This body that I mentioned, the Palestine Conciliation Commission, was put into being in large measure in order to enable Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and their properties. And these were the instructions that the State Department, authorized by President Truman, gave to Mark Etheridge to create conditions that would compel Israel to accept the repatriation of a substantial number. Not all. The United States never supported the repatriation of all Palestinian refugees, but for many, many months and even a year, you could argue the United States was putting diplomatic pressure on Israel to actually effectuate the return of at least some Palestinian refugees. The problem is, just like today, when the Biden administration makes a policy pronouncement, we want to see a ceasefire. If it's not backed up by any tangible consequences on Israel for violating what the US policy goals are, and there's no consequences imposed on Israel as a result, then there's no incentive for Israel to modulate and change its behavior. So that's what we saw back in 1949. The United States did sanction Israel for a while. They suspended a very important bank loan that they had extended to Israel, which was in deep economic trouble at the time, and they really needed this loan. But the United States ultimately didn't utilize that leverage to the fullest degree that it could have to have enforced its policy goal of making sure that at least a substantial portion of Palestinian refugees were enabled to return to their home.
Thank you, Josh. Sounds like enforcement mechanisms are a recurring issue. Thank you so much. I'm going to quickly throw it to my colleague, Eric, and then we're going to go to Estee Chandler. But Eric, do you want to take it away for a quick minute?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. And it's such a privilege and an honor just to speak for a minute or two on this panel and to hear from and be in solidarity with all of these amazing experts and organizers. So I'm an organizer with the Teach-In Network, but I just want to take a minute or two to speak about my experience at UMass Amherst, where I'm a history PhD candidate, but also an educator and a campus organizer. And I think the case study of UMass is a testament to the vital role that political education can play in building collective power and fostering more democratic communities and societies. And so UMass has a storied history of activism on campus, of radical activism, but in more recent decades, this is kind of tapered off. But this changed dramatically last year. And among the shifting or the driving factors in this shift was the organizing of a series of talks and teach-ins. This was a concerted campaign serving to challenge university elites and to make it impossible for them to shield their ongoing complicity in the genocide under the guise of complexity. So for all of us on campus witnessing the horrors of the first live stream genocide, learning about the integral role that the country and the university play in it, this provided not only the knowledge, but the obligation that comes with that knowledge, right? The obligation to speak truth to power, right? To resist genocide from the heart of empire, to demand accountability at home and abroad, and to democratize our campus, our community, and our country. And once the university, right, lost this intellectual battle here and elsewhere, they did so decisively. They turned to the only tool they had left, right? Violent repression, which is ongoing, right? And so I just want basically to say that the fact that UMass was the site of one of the largest mass arrests in the country last spring was no accident, right? The fact that nearly every Democratic representative body on our campus voted to divest from military contractors, war profiteers, and Israeli companies in blatant violation of international law was no accident. Right, despite these challenges, right, this movement on campus, this movement at UMass and other campuses has momentum, and we need it, right, as we face an uphill battle as the genocide continues. And this movement is on the side of humanity, on the right side of history. And if we continue the struggle together for a better world, a less violent, a less militarized, a more equitable and just world, we can realize it, and we will realize it. But those of us on campus and elsewhere, we need your help. We need your support. We need as many people as possible that can work with us to further this goal, to share their knowledge, resources, strategies, and insights in the service of building collective power. And so we ask you to join us, to support the Teach-In Network, to get involved. Check out our website. Our Teach-In Toolbox is our growing list of expert speakers. Join our mailing list for updates, be in contact with us, and organize more and more teach-ins across the country. And I just want to say thank you all, and free Palestine.
Thank you, Eric. Another live speaker, and then a quick video, and then we'll get into a larger Q&A for our remaining time. We're running a little bit behind, though, but we'll try to get there. Estee Chandler will be speaking next about organizing in solidarity with Palestine and against genocide. Estee is the founder of Jewish Voice for Peace Los Angeles. She's a board chair for JVP Action, and she's the host and producer of Middle East in Focus on KPFK. Estee, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Teach-In Network and to all of the participants who showed up to listen, and especially to all of the amazing panelists who are friends and experts who I continue to learn from all the time. Over the past 14 months, JVP has remained very public with our actions calling for a ceasefire and arms embargo on Israel, beginning on October 18th, 2023, helping to organize the largest ever Jewish demonstration in support of Palestinians, attended by approximately 5,000 people in Washington, D.C., followed by over 400 of us being arrested, singing and chanting "Ceasefire Now" and "Free Palestine" in the rotunda of the Cannon House office building during a sit-in led by JVP rabbis. 2 weeks later, at another sit-in, as thousands of people chanted, 500 supporters participated in a civil disobedience action, with 350 being arrested, including rabbis, elected officials, elders, and celebrities, this time shutting down all train lines and entrances at Grand Central Station in the largest act of civil disobedience in New York City since the Iraq War. This action included Mourn the Dead and Fight for the Living and Ceasefire Now projections onto surrounding buildings. 1 month into Israel's genocidal war, when over 10,000 Palestinians had already been killed, among them over 4,000 children, JVP New York City led hundreds more Jews and allies in occupying Liberty Island, surrounding the Statue of Liberty, young people and elders, rabbis, descendants of Holocaust survivors, and elected officials singing "Ceasefire Now" and carrying banners that read, "The world is watching. Palestinians should be free and never again for anyone." Just a week later, over 1,000 protesters shut down Chicago's Ogilvy Transportation Center in downtown Chicago to demand a ceasefire. And a few days after that, on November 15th, hundreds of Angelenos joined JVPLA and allies, shutting down the intersection of Hollywood and Highland, an iconic location in the film capital of the world, for several hours on a rare, dark, rainy day in Los Angeles. And for months, actions like these took place across the country. And as we approach another calendar year fighting this horrific genocide, I'll be honest, the exhaustion, disgust, and frustration so many are feeling is real. But with the genocide raging on, we have to as well. So at JVP Action, our strategy remains to demand and force a shift in US government policy. Our government is the main enabler of Israeli impunity, allowing the continuation of this genocide and making US policy an urgent target for our movement. We're clear-eyed that the US government will be the last domino to fall. Nonetheless, we are seeing cracks in the consensus. A year of endless horrors and mass protest has changed many people's minds about US support for Israel. Polling now shows that 77% of Democratic voters don't want to send more weapons to Israel. Neither does 62% of independents and 61% of everybody polled. The Joint Resolutions of Disapproval, or JRDs, for Israeli arms sales introduced recently in the Senate by Bernie Sanders was a unique and immediate opportunity to push the demand to stop arming Israel and to get media attention for our demands. And JVP Action went all out to support the JRDs, along with many allies, from the introduction of the resolutions to the votes and beyond. The movement goal was to get 15 to 25 senators to vote yes on blocking those weapons shipments to Israel. So in the end, getting 19 senators who voted yes was absolutely an organizing win for our movement. Too little and far too late. And sickening that the Senate majority still rejected such an absolute bare minimum that was being asked for in these bills nearly 14 months into this US-backed genocide. Nonetheless, getting 19 senators to openly break with and directly oppose a weapons shipment that Biden, their party leader, lobbied hard for, along with AIPAC, who spent considerable funds on ad campaigns, and groups like Democratic Majority for Israel, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and the Federation, who were all working hard to push through this legislation or to push through the arms sales, is positive change for the movement, as is the labor movement joining the movement, to liberate Palestinians, which creates even more momentum. Labor is a key constituency that the Democratic Party depends on for votes, for financial contributions, and for volunteerism. In October of 2023, younger union members and many Arab American labor activists in Dearborn, Michigan, began to pressure their unions to take a stand for peace and to demand action from the president. Brandon Mansilla, a regional director with United Automobile Workers and a supporter of the peace movement, said that by early November, large numbers of UAW members were attending movement demonstrations for ceasefire, wearing their UAW hats and jackets and openly expressing their wishes to see their union take a stand. And last December, the UAW leaders listened, making UAW the nation's largest union to back an immediate ceasefire. As that was happening, the Biden administration was faced with another major rebuke of its policies. In February, more than 100,000 voters in Michigan cast uncommitted votes in the primary election, in the first of many similar ballot protests in the 2024 primaries. We know that moving into 2025, we need to continue building financial pressure on the genocide economy. Across the country, students and people of conscience continue pushing their institutions to divest from the Israeli genocide and US war economy. Yet as the US government's military aid to Israel continues to funnel billions of dollars right back to weapons manufacturers in the US, the apartheid and genocide economy of the Israeli regime is actually tanking. This is another opportunity for our movement, and it makes it all the more critical for us to escalate our ongoing strategy of boycott and divestment campaigns. JVP's campaign to divest from Israel bonds, which are direct investments in the Israeli government, is one example of how we can capitalize on the faltering Israeli economy and cut off the flow of funds to Israel's apartheid regime. Financial pressure works both by materially weakening institutions complicit in genocide, and also by demonstrating the growing international opposition to Israel's oppression of Palestinians. Over the past year, as we've been organizing and executing strategic mobilizations towards ending this genocide, our institutions have made it very clear how resistant they are to democratic pressure. But we have had some smaller wins across the country, passing ceasefire and divestment resolutions, which teach us important lessons about how we can effectively mobilize moving forward. We need to continue to create material impact within specific campaigns. And in that context, we're most likely to make impact through mobilizations that escalate pressure on existing targets, whether they are politicians, institutions invested in the Israeli government and the US war economy, or other key pressure points. Escalating effectively requires us bringing in and mobilizing new constituencies that matter to decision makers and demonstrate the growing mass demand to stop arming Israel. And we also have to continue to shift the narrative in ways that expose what's really happening. The US continues sending bombs to the Israeli military to benefit its own financial and imperial interests, not because they're interested in Jewish safety. Actions that intervene in the mainstream narratives build crucial pressure on elected decision makers. So our fight continues, and it's never been more important for our movement to work on multiple levels, targeting key political and financial pressure points, and to advance our demand for an arms embargo. Both the outgoing and incoming administrations have made it clear that they intend to continue the current policies of arming and diplomatically enabling Israel's genocide. So our job is to channel our devastation and rage by everything we've seen over these past 14 months into recommitting to the movement for Palestinian liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estee. I have so many questions for you just as an organizer, really. Thank you for all you do. I have a 3.5-year-old. I'm afraid to be arrested. Does getting arrested with hundreds of comrades for peace who are all chanting with you and are all there for the same reason, does that make getting arrested sting a little less?
I mean, I'm sure that is true for some people, but what's important for people to know is that there are many people like you who have family obligations that don't make getting arrested the best use of their time and energy. And what's important to know is mass actions like that take a lot of organizing behind the scenes. There's, logistics, there's fundraising, there's a lot that goes into those things so that, for people who are not in a position to go out and get arrested, there's tons of work to be done, both on those kinds of mass actions, but also towards, the other work that JVP and all of our allied organizations do, each and every day and week.
Right. 19 senators voted with Bernie against sending weapons. That's a big change from even a couple years ago. Looking back a couple years ago, was that even in the realm of possibility? And as an organizer, are you seeing the fruits of your efforts in these cracks forming in the pro-Israeli armor that protects both parties?
Yes, I mean, we in years past, we could have expected maybe 3 votes or 3 people to support, and probably not even to have it coming for a vote. This was a very unique situation where a senator could bring, these 3 resolutions of the 6 that ended up being brought to the floor. We're definitely seeing a shift, and I can tell you that that shift started from the first mass action that we did in Washington, D.C., in the days and weeks before that, we were having trouble getting in touch with people in congressional offices who we had been working with. You know, we were getting messages that were, you know, basically akin to lose my phone number. And when that action started, people who were there not getting arrested, but being there to answer those calls immediately went to, and were having meetings all over the Hill. And the questions that were being asked were different than the last time we were there lobbying them. And the questions and the attitudes towards people, even offices who aren't doing what we're asking, have changed. We are definitely seeing change, and that's why we know we need to keep pushing.
You're doing excellent work. Thank you. I really liked at the end, you mentioned unions too and the importance there. It immediately made me think of South Korea. It's a totally different situation, but you saw mass, nonviolent movement of people stopping a coup, and then the trades, the labor coming out and saying, no, we're not doing anything until you step down. That's the power I want. That's what we need so bad. So thank you, Estee, for all you're doing. Thank you for your organizing. It means so much. Keep it up. Best of luck, and we're with you. Moving on now. Eric, if you could cue up our video from Ramzy Baroud, who's going to speak about resistance and the genocide in Gaza. He's not able to join us, but he sent a video. Ramzy is the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and he's the author of 6 books on Palestine. Eric, can you pull that up now? Go. All right. Whenever you're ready. Oh, we're not having any audio. We'll give this.
Called Nusayr. The genocide in Gaza is not the start of history. The genocide in Gaza is one of the most horrific, if not single-handedly the most horrific event of violence carried out by settler colonial apartheid Israel against the Palestinian people. But all of this did not happen in a vacuum either. The Palestinian people have been experiencing Israeli violence at various stages of their history. They are a nation that has been colonized since 1947-48. And they are being collectively punished for resisting that colonialism. Israel is a settler colonial society. This is why Gaza is ours forever conference. And that's why, you know, the article in the Jerusalem Post arguing that Lebanon, South Lebanon is not the south of Lebanon, but rather the north of Israel. This is kind of mainstream thinking in Israel. You know, this whole idea of greater Israel as promoted by Bezalel Smotrich, but also Bin Gvir and many others, including Netanyahu himself. They don't truly believe that the borders of the state of Israel are viable and defensible in their current form. Therefore, they need to create constant, you know, this constant urge or need to create buffer zones. And the buffer zones become occupied territories, and the occupied territories become annexed territories, and the annexed territories become part of this greater Israel. It's the Israeli settler colonial game that they have been playing for such a long, long time. Just look at the West Bank and you will understand why this is the case. If you look at the roots of how Israeli settlements become settlements, it starts with a small caravan, a mobile home or two, a water generator, electric generator, a single family moves in, a whole unit of the Israeli army comes to protect it, and the family becomes 2, 10, 100, and then the settlement becomes a city, and the city becomes recognized by the government as if legal, and it become, you know, the illegal becomes legal, and so forth and so on. And now they are saying, well, you know, let's annex the entirety of the West Bank. But you see, the whole thing starts with a caravan, it ends with annexing the entirety of the West Bank. That's settler colonialism. Palestinians, of course, have recognized that from the very, very beginning. And they have fought against it. They have mobilized against it. They have resisted it in every possible form using armed resistance or popular mobilization. A very quick distinction here. Let me just check the time to see if I exceeded. And I might have exceeded it. So I'm going to try to make it a bit short. For Palestinians, the idea of resistance is not an academic theory. It's not something that is conjured up within the convenience that is available to us, activists and scholars and writers and journalists and analysts and all of that in various parts of the world. You know, what is the most moral and ethical form of resistance, and so forth and so on. It doesn't exist in Palestine itself, at least not in the refugee camp where I was born and raised. Nobody talks about it. Maybe you'll find some university somewhere in the West Bank where some Western educated intellectuals kind of talk about these issues, but they don't really matter a great deal to ordinary people, because in Palestine, the term we use for resistance is muqawama. And when we talk about muqawama, we immediately assume that is an all-encompassing concept that includes everything. An old woman can practice muqawama by insisting on setting vegetable stands in a market where the Israeli army told her that she couldn't do so. Or a teacher insists on muqawama by teaching Palestinian history to children, even though it is not allowed by the Israeli military administration. A man can practice muqawama by wearing a kufiya, even though he could pay a heavy price for wearing that Palestinian national symbol. But it's the same mode of thinking that makes them see that muqawama as someone carrying a gun and resisting the Israeli army invading a refugee camp, as we see in Jabalia and Beit Lahia and Khan Yunis, Deir al-Balah, Nusayrat, and all these other places right now. They don't see it as two separate entities of thinking. Just it's essentially the same idea. So I think it's really important that we clarify this. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons behind Israel's utter madness and frustration, is that the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, have never ceased resisting or using various methods of muqawama since the beginning of the Israeli colonialism of Palestine, even before the establishment of Israel on the ruins of Palestinian homes in 1947-48. So we are here looking at two different elements here. A colonial state that keeps expanding at the expense of the native population, and a native population that is fighting back in all of its power, by all of its means, even at the expense of their very extermination. I think it's, anyone who has, I don't want to, kind of use emotional language, but anyone with a conscience, with a heart, any human being, any feeling human being cannot possibly look at what's happening in Gaza and see children being massacred in large numbers and find any kind of excuse or justification or context that would explain why the Israelis are doing this to the Palestinians. I think it's obvious that we are at a historical juncture. And I think those who have turned their backs and turned their conscience and their eyes and gaze somewhere else while Palestinians are being killed in such large numbers, I think they will have to answer to themselves and their children in the future to why they have done nothing while Palestinians were being massacred. My promise to you, in fact, my pledge to you, is that the Palestinian people will never cease resisting. And it's not because I am offering any sort of prophecy here, but as a people's historian who wrote many books on people's history of Palestine, I tell you that resistance or muqawama in Palestine is a concept that comes from the collective heart and collective conscience of the Palestinian people. And that's why they resist. There's a culture of resistance that is much deeper than any intellectual or academic argument. And they use it, they utilize it to its fullest. Israel knows that, and they know that well, and this is why they are very disturbed. In fact, they are very disturbed by the latest numbers that within this year of genocide, in 2024, 64,000 Palestinian babies were born. And they find that extremely frustrating because we've killed a very large number of them, and 64,000 of them were born. Many of them were born without dads, and many of them actually they had their moms either died during birth or died afterwards. But for us Palestinians, this is how we resist our survival, our continuity, our persistence is a form of resistance as well. One last thing I'd like to add, and I apologize for exceeding my time, is that I feel like the conversation like this one is quite important because it takes us, it pushes us forward from that of trying to find excuses or justification or even apologizing for why Palestinians do this and do that into the more urgent and critical conversations of thinking beyond the genocide. How do we hold Israel accountable when the war is over? How do we ensure that there can never be any rethinking of what Israel has done or any attempt at creating a moral equivalence between what the Israeli government and military is doing and what the Palestinian people are going through? I very much appreciate this particular teach-in, and thank you for including me. And I encourage you to do more and more of this again, because we really do need to elevate the conversation from the defensiveness that you kind of see in mainstream media into these kind of critical thinking about Palestine post this genocide, about how do we rebuild Gaza. And I mean rebuild Gaza in terms of discourse, in terms of language, in terms of how we situate our understanding of Gaza within the larger history of the Palestinian struggle against Israeli settler colonialism. Thank you very much, and hope to join you again in a future teaching. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me.
If you could shut that down. Thank you, Eric. That was Ramzy Baroud, who's not able to be with us, but we have lots of questions that have come in. So we're going to spend the next, if our speakers can hang on for 5 minutes for a couple questions, that would be great. If not, that's okay. Josh Ruebner, Huwaida Arraf, Estee Chandler, Assal Rad, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to ask a couple questions. Feel free to just hop in if you want to answer it. They're kind of for everyone. To start, can someone besides the president do anything about this? Can anyone uphold the U.S. laws the U.S. is breaking by giving Israel weapons? Is everyone just choosing not to? Biden doesn't offer any hope, obviously, and Trump doesn't really offer any hope either. Congressman, can we have, is there hope anywhere else within the U.S. government to stop this? Anyone who wants to hop in? If not, that's okay. Go ahead, Josh.
It is very difficult. So much of the power is in the hands of the president to enforce the laws, which are being completely ignored. And that's why the vote on the joint resolutions of disapproval that Estee mentioned, where 19 senators voted to block weapons to Israel, was so historically significant. This was the first time in 77 years that Congress actually took a vote to block weapons to Israel. So this mechanism that the Senate has for forcing a vote on particular weapons deliveries is one of the unique mechanisms that Congress has to actually have it within its power to block particular weapons delivery. But of course, Congress controls the purse, right? So Congress can choose not to appropriate any money for weapons to Israel. And that's a demand that we should be making of our members of Congress as well.
Thank you, Josh. And last question, last thing, let me find where it went. Well, I lost the question, but we have some Palestinians watching here today with us, and they want to know if what makes you feel hopeful what do you have that gives you hope right now, that there will be some success here, or that our movement will continue to grow for peace? Anybody? Why did I see your video? Anybody want to try to take that?
I can quickly say that for us, in this past year, by every metric, our organization has either doubled or tripled in size. I think that shows, the growth that we need. And for me personally, the most encouraging thing is the generational shift. That the overwhelming majority of the people that we are organizing with on the streets now are young people who get it. They just have no patience for any kind of bigotry. They are not, wedded to any political party, and they are not going to stop as long as they see the US government engaged in a genocide.
I can briefly add to that. I wholeheartedly agree, especially when we're looking at the younger generation, those on university campuses. I mean, they are sacrificing a lot and they're not giving up despite the repression. And in a few years, they're going to be in positions of power. So I think that there's going to be a noticeable and massive shift. And I have the honor and pleasure of over the years having worked with so many people from around the country with the international solidarity movement and other international efforts where I've seen people really put their lives on hold and their safety and sacrifice a lot to travel and to stand with Palestinians, and that has meant a lot to Palestinians. Even with the Freedom Flotilla in April, I was with hundreds of people that knew how dangerous it was to get on the sea and go challenge Israel's illegal blockade, and were still willing to do it. And were so upset when we were stopped. So this growing number of people who are just a lot of them, most of them not Palestinian, but still so committed, just keeps me believing in humanity. And just the last thing, honestly, I have to say is really the most thing is the Palestinian people themselves. When I was in Palestine, just seeing kind of the most horrific things happen to people that I grew to deeply care about. And even though these Palestinians have not known a day of freedom in their lives and are fighting a massive effort to get rid of them, they still found opportunities to laugh and to enjoy life and to insist on life and to make you feel welcome. So that kind of humanity, and then the fact that the Palestinians still have not given up, that just, aside from hope, that just gives me the message of who am I and what right do I have to give up? So we keep going.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much. Josh Ruebner, Huwaida Arraf, Estee Chandler, Assal Rad, Ramzy Baroud. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to the attendees. Last thing, teachinnetwork.org. Sign up to get involved. You can sign up if you just want to learn more about organizing. You can sign up just to get updates, or you can sign up because you're organizing a teach-in right now and you need some of these awesome speakers to come speak to your group. If you want to donate, teachinnetwork.org/donate. Every dollar helps keep us going, helps us keep making resources, building out our staff, building out our speakers network. Anything you can do help. And with that, thank you all. Peace to everybody. Free Palestine. And I hope to see you all soon.